Welcome back to the Unmeasured podcast. I'm really excited to kick off our first ever podcast series here that's going to be all about perfection. I got an awesome question from a listener who shares perfectionist here and wondering where do I even start to make a change? And because I have so much to share on this topic and would love to offer as much support as I can, I decided to break up my response into a couple of episodes, a couple parts of a series. And so today is part one. We are quite literally going to start at the beginning. So for anyone here who relates to feeling like a perfectionist, whether you are what I refer to as a capital P perfectionist, someone who says, like, yes, that's me, I'm a perfectionist, or someone else who might just be struggling with perfectionist tendencies in one or more areas of life, then this series is for you. And I'm really going to break it down for you, offer you some insight, offer you some opportunities to be curious with yourself, to connect with yourself so that you can start to make a change. I want to kick us off by saying that perfectionism is not who you are. It's not your identity. You've heard me say that before, but it bears repeating. It is a coping mechanism developed to keep you safe. It's self-preservation, it's self-protection. And at some point in your life, you develop perfectionism or perfectionist tendencies as a self-protective mechanism. And so that means that because it's not who you are, because it's not your identity, it is possible to do things differently. And so I'm really excited to share with you some building blocks that you can use to begin to make a change if perfectionism or perfectionist tendencies is something that you struggle with. I also want to give a high level overview of some of the ways that perfectionism can show up for us in our lives. And that will help you to identify how you might be experiencing it. It can show up as really high, unreasonable, unrealistic, or even impossible standards for yourself that you truly try to hold yourself to at all costs. It can be perfectionist paralysis, which is where you feel pressure to do something perfectly, but you also feel like you'll never be able to live up to those expectations. And you're so afraid of failure. You're so afraid of falling short that you just don't do it to begin with, right? You don't start something because you're afraid that you won't be able to do it perfectly. It can show up as all or nothing mindset. It can show up as running constantly on the hamster wheel of achievement or external validation. And it can also show up as people pleasing. So, a couple of ways that perfectionism can show up in your life in one or more areas. So, just be cognizant of that as you are reflecting on your own personal experience with perfection. And it's always really important to know that it doesn't just look one specific way. So when we think about changing our, perfectionist mindset or our perfectionist tendencies, there really are these three major phases that I think about us needing to move through. The first phase is shedding. Okay. So we've got to shed the perfectionist mindset, the perfectionist tendencies. The second phase is exploring. So this is where you explore who you are without that perfectionism. And the final phase is the embodiment. This is the integration phase where you really start to embody who you are without that perfection, without that perfectionism. So we've got the shedding phase, which is first, the exploring phase, which is second, and the embodying, the integration phase, which is third. So shedding, exploring, and embodying. Really important just to know that to me, there are these three distinct phases that we will cycle through over and over again in our own personal experience. When we start to identify, okay, I'm experiencing perfectionism or perfectionist tendencies, and I want to do something differently, I want to make a change. we oftentimes are experiencing a lot of self judgment at that moment in time also, right? Because perfection is it's a very limiting belief. It is a very, very narrow way of seeing success or seeing good or seeing right. And we feel like anything other than that really limiting belief of perfect is failure. And there's a lot of judgment that comes with that, a lot of self judgment. So we can't really see ourselves clearly when we are in that moment of time. So, what I really want to offer to you is a practice of curiosity with yourself. I want to help you to identify, how is perfectionism showing up in your life? How does perfectionism truly show up for you? And through a series of these self reflection questions, you're going to be able to specifically identify how perfectionism shows up in your life. So, you're going to have awareness and clarity and self understanding, which is going to allow you to switch from judgment about yourself and about your perfectionism into curiosity. And that curiosity leads to that deeper understanding, that deeper self connection. So we really want to be curious with yourself here. And I'm going to provide you with a series of questions that can help you to do that. So if you want to, I would recommend grabbing a journal, a pen and paper, however you like to take notes for the latter part of this episode so that you can jot down what those questions are and do a little self reflection, do a little journaling. It is so normal at this moment in time, at the beginning part of this process, to feel frustration. It's also normal to feel frustration further along in the process when you maybe feel like you have done a lot of healing or you've made a lot of progress in terms of perfectionism, but then you're met with a new situation where that mindset or those tendencies pop up, right? It's like frustration that you have to deal with this. It's also natural to experience fear that nothing will be different. So, frustration, very normal and natural at this moment in time. Fear that nothing will ever be different, very normal and natural at this time. And also, it can just feel overwhelming, right? Where it's like, wow, okay, I now have awareness that I'm dealing with this thing and I have awareness that I want to do it differently. But now I'm overwhelmed thinking about the fact that I am going to have to make that happen. So it's really important that as we are moving through the shedding phase, that we offer ourselves compassion while you learn to do it differently. So offering compassion while you learn to do it differently. And I want to just give you comfort that this is part of the process, right? So it's normal, natural, totally part of the process to feel frustration, fear, or even overwhelm at this moment in time. I want to help you to start to find clarity in the midst of that, to start to find self connection in the midst of that, to start to practice curiosity in the midst of that, to start to see how perfectionism is showing up for you, start to identify your patterns. And we do this through self reflection. It's just so, so important. I want to also point out that there is a podcast episode. I probably reference this episode more than any other one, but it's the episode on self compassion. And I break down the practice of self compassion. And so, as you're moving through this, as you're moving through these questions that I'm going to offer you today to practice with yourself, to be curious with yourself, if you find yourself feeling the fear, the frustration, the overwhelm, that unmeasured podcast episode on self compassion could be really powerful. So, the first thing that I want to encourage you to do is jot down all of the areas, the moments in your life where you feel pressure to be perfect. So, this might be the pressure to do something perfectly, to say something perfectly, to feel something perfectly, right? Like to have a certain reaction or response or experience, to accomplish something perfectly, to live, via the perfect timeline, to have the perfect look, to be the perfect friend, to get the perfect feedback or praise, to hit your goals perfectly. Really think about all of the areas or moments in your life where you feel pressure to be perfect. Let it flow, brain dump, jot it all down. This is the first most important step. And then I want you to think about these experiences that you just wrote down. And for each of them, write what are all of the rules or the shoulds or the expectations that you have for yourself in this area of your life. So, what we're really looking here is step one is where do you feel the pressure to be perfect? Step two is how are you actually defining quote unquote perfect in each of these instances? So, we're going a little bit deeper. Here's where I feel pressure to be perfect. Number one, you're jotting down all of those areas. Number two, what are the shoulds, the rules, the expectations for each of these things? AKA, how are you defining perfect in each of these instances? Then, for each of these instances, I want you to think about, do you experience all or nothing thinking when it comes to any of these areas or moments? And if so, which ones specifically? So just identify of all of these areas that you jotted down, which ones do you experience all or nothing thinking, all or nothing mindset when it comes to those? And an example of that could be, let's say you feel pressure to be perfect when it comes to your workouts and you identify some rules, some should, some expectations, and you realize that if I can't work out for at least 45 minutes, it doesn't count. So that's all or nothing mindset, right? It's either 45 minutes or it's nothing. Anything less than 45 minutes is nothing. Anything less than perfect is failure. So identifying any instances of all or nothing mindset for each of those. Then I want you to think again. So filtering back through each of these instances that you jotted down, each of these areas or moments or experiences in your life, thinking about them through the filter now of conditional thinking. So if X, then Y. In any of these areas or moments, do you experience conditional thinking? If so, what does conditional thinking sound like for you? So, an example might be, once I have the perfect body, and of course, you've already identified what that means to you from the previous exercises. Once I have the perfect body, then I will open myself up to date. Or another example might be, once my house is perfectly decorated, then I will finally be able to host my loved ones in my home, right? So it's conditional thinking. If X, then Y, or once X, then Y. So you're running through your list with these filters. The first is the all or nothing mindset. Where do you have it? What does it look like? The second is conditional thinking. Where do you have it? What does it sound like? Then I want you to think about people pleasing. So we're going to run this list through the filter of people pleasing. Is people pleasing a form of perfection that you experience? If so, how does that show up for you? So when a friend opens up to me, I'm always thinking about how I can respond perfectly. Or at work, I can't say no when someone asks me for help, even when I'm totally overwhelmed because I don't want to let them down and I want to be the perfect coworker. So again, you're running through that list and saying, do I experience people pleasing when it comes to this specific thing? And if so, what does that look like for me? So this is where I want you to start. You're being curious with yourself. You're understanding more about your experience, what it's like for you. Jot down any notes, thoughts, reflections when it comes to this list. And this is going to help you to shift from that judgment about your perfection, that judgment about yourself, into curiosity, into deeper self understanding. And you are going to start to create the clarity that you need to move forward. I'm so excited about this series with you all. And I feel like it's going to be a really meaningful series for us to get to do together. So grab your journal, grab your pen, start to reflect, start to be curious with yourself, start to gain a deeper understanding with yourself as we move through this first phase, this shedding phase. And I will be back next episode with more.